When I grew up as a Muslim, I was taught that homosexuality was a disgusting abomination that violates Allah's natural order of life. Ask most Muslims around the world, and they'll likely say something similar. Homosexuality is a sin, and the sinners will be punished by Allah for their transgressions. But if you'd asked Muhsin Hendricks, a man often referred to as the world's first openly gay Imam, he would have had a different answer. For him, being gay was not incompatible with being Muslim.
I think God is not homophobic. We are.
On February 15, Muhsin Hendricks was shot and killed in South Africa by gunmen who are still at large as of the recording of this video. It's a horrible way to die and an incredible tragedy. At this point, we still don't know much about who killed Hendricks or why. Many are speculating it was a hate crime perpetrated by Muslims because of Hendricks' open defiance of mainstream Islamic doctrine. But instead of spending time talking about what are still only speculations, in this video, I'm going to talk about Hendricks' attempts to create an LGBTQ-friendly Islam, why it has faced resistance from Muslims, and if an LGBTQ-friendly Islam is even possible. Let's start by talking about Muhsin and his life's mission. Born in Cape Town to a Muslim family in 1967, Hendricks was married with children, but then got divorced, and at the age of 29, he came out to his family. Hendricks shared that his mother collapsed when he told her, and she said, "My religion doesn't accept this." Hendricks, after all, came from a family where his own grandfather was an Imam, and had studied in Pakistan to become an Imam himself. According to Hendricks, his mother eventually accepted his homosexuality, but when he came out, he got fired from his teaching job at a mosque. 2 years later, Hendricks began operating as an Imam, hosting a safe space for LGBTQ Muslims, where they could pray and get counseling, and even get a Muslim marriage ceremony officiated by him. South Africa made sense as a base of operations. Its constitution was the first in the world to protect people from discrimination because of their sexual orientation, and in 2006, South Africa also legally recognized same-sex marriage. Other Muslims were aware of his safe space, and they didn't approve. In 2007, a local Muslim council decreed that Hendricks was out of the fold of Islam, essentially excommunicating him. He didn't care, insisting that Islam is not as hierarchical as Christianity, and he didn't need permission to be an Imam if there was an LGBTQ Muslim community that needed one. He was even advised to hire bodyguards for his own safety, but he wasn't afraid of being attacked.
Definitely bringing back the death sentence for this guy.
I think this Muslim should be thrown off a mountain or burned or something like that.
And it just didn't bother me. The need to be authentic was greater than the fear to die.
In 2011, Hendricks set up his own mosque in Cape Town, intended to be a safe haven for gay and other marginalized Muslims. The tiny mosque, which didn't even have a sign marking it on the street, had about 20 regular worshippers and up to 80 occasional visitors by 2022. There were more women than men in his congregation, and there was no gender segregation. Hendricks was described by those who knew him as a hard worker dedicated to his mission. Suicide rates are very high among young LGBTQ people, and he wanted to help save lives. Hendricks was also described as gentle and playful.
Often people ask me, "You're doing such a dangerous, controversial thing. Have you had no death threats?" None whatsoever. And I think it's because of my approach to the work. I always say that I'm not confrontational, I'm carefrontational.
He connected with other gay imams in countries like Australia and the US, and yes, there's more than one gay imam. And in 2019, he traveled to Kenya to promote LGBTQ rights in the failed fight to decriminalize homosexuality there. On his life's work, Hendricks said, "I'm hoping there will be more queer imams, so when I'm no longer around, we can continue to exist and grow." Those words became poignant last week after Hendricks' tragic murder. On February 15, Hendricks was visiting another South African city to officiate the marriages of two interfaith heterosexual couples. Hendricks had just conducted one of the ceremonies and was traveling in a car with another person to perform the next ceremony when a pickup truck blocked their path. Two men with face coverings jumped out of the vehicle, and one of them shot multiple times at Hendricks' car, killing him. There was an outpouring of grief and tributes for Hendricks, including from religious leaders of other denominations and Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa. Two South African Islamic organizations that represent imams, including the one that basically excommunicated Hendricks back in 2007, also condemned his killing. According to local police, the motive for the killing is still unknown and under investigation, but many are considering this a hate crime because of Hendricks' identity and his activities, and contrary to what he claimed, because he'd received several death threats over the years.
My next question, whether you or Muhsin ever felt that there was any kind of threat to his life linked specifically to his work?
Well, yes, I think that he did experience threats to his life, that he was threatened, in fact, because of his work.
While we don't know exactly why he was killed, his death and his life's work raise an important question. Is there a future where Islam accepts LGBTQ people? For Hendricks, his focus wasn't just convincing Muslims that you could be queer and Muslim. His focus was promoting the idea that there wasn't one single right way to practice Islam. Was he right? Well, yes, in a sense. There is no such thing as a singular true Islam, as much as many Muslims will claim that there is one, all emanating from the perfection that is Allah. Beyond a universal Muslim belief that Allah is the creator of the universe and there's only one Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, it's more accurate to say that there are constantly evolving and overlapping groups of consensus within Islam. It's basically an ongoing conversation around the beliefs of the roughly 2 billion Muslims out there in the world. And when it comes to homosexuality, the majority consensus is that it's a major sin. Muslims reference the story of the prophet Lut in the Quran, who was sent by Allah to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, immoral sinners who committed shameful deeds that no man had ever done before. So the story goes. In Surah Al-A'raf, the Quran says, "You lust after men instead of women. You are certainly transgressors." These verses are more or less repeated multiple times in the Quran and are backed up by hadiths like this one that outline the Prophet Muhammad's command to kill the perpetrators and those who they commit the sin with. And then, of course, there's also Islamic scholarly opinion. And as the similar story in the Bible goes, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by Allah for the people's transgressions. Within Christianity, there's been efforts to reinterpret the Sodom and Gomorrah story with the view that it wasn't homosexuality that drew God's wrath, but rather things like rape and inhospitality to guests that were the actual sins. Using this interpretation, combined with beliefs that a truly loving Jesus wouldn't judge someone for the sexual orientation that they can't control, there are now many LGBTQ-friendly churches around the world with LGBTQ clergy. This is definitely a minority within the Christian consensus, but it is an example of how the conversation and consensus around homosexuality has shifted within Christianity over the centuries, and arguably it's led to Christianity itself changing. So Hendricks held a similar interpretation about the Quranic verses about homosexuality I referenced earlier.
Often you hear your grandfather talking about, how gay people are going to go to hell, and then you think, well, I think I'm one of them, and how can my grandfather speak of a very compassionate God and at the same time a God that condemns me for something that I didn't choose? So around the age of 16, I sort of just drowned myself in religion for fear that I might go to hell.
But in his view, there was nothing in its pages that clearly prohibited same-sex relations.
It was either about molestation on the highways or it was about coercive sex. And I'm like, what is the story got to do with me? Or with anybody who is just innately attracted to the same sex with no choice of their own. I think it's got a lot to do with the culture more than what Islam really says about homosexuality. One of my conversations with God is, I'm going to not stop fasting until you tell me what it is that you want from me. What am I supposed to do with my life? And it ended up that I fasted about 80 days. And close towards the 80th day, I felt very comfortable with my relationship with God, comfortable with my understanding of Islam, and comfortable with who I am as a queer person.
With his LGBTQ-friendly mosque and his marriage to a man, Hendricks practiced what he preached. He also criticized the South African Muslims who basically excommunicated him, saying, "Instead of coming to sit with me and saying, let's look at your research and see if it's plausible, maybe we can learn something, it's easier to say it's out of the fold of Islam." To make matters worse for Hendricks in the perception of Muslims, the man he was married to was a Hindu, another big no-no in Islam. So here's another big question. Could the efforts of Hendricks and others lead to an Islam where LGBTQ Muslims are generally accepted by the mainstream? This increasingly seems to be the case with Christianity, so why not Islam too, some might say? It just needs more time to catch up, and eventually the believers of the major religions will disregard the religion's homophobia the same way most of them disregard the religion's support of slavery. But if you ask me, it's not impossible that one day, very far into the future, Islam could reform and become LGBTQ friendly even more than Christianity is today. But to me, Hendricks' efforts, while noble, were misdirected. Islam's problems aren't restricted to its cruelty and ignorance regarding homosexuality. They extend to the way it commands obedience through fear. Hendricks preached the Quran filled with the threats of suffering and punishment for the disbelievers. A Quran that defined this life as a test you had to pass for an afterlife that we have to take it on. Blind faith and wishful thinking exists when this life is the only one we know we have for sure. Blind faith brings me to the other big problem of Islam. Hendricks was promoting a religion and God with no good evidence for their truth. Put simply, he spent his days preaching and reinterpreting what we can only honestly conclude is a man-made lie.
The struggle between my sexual identity, which is intrinsic to me, and my Islamic identity, which is also something that I would not give up because it's so important for me, was quite a big struggle.
Instead of trying to preserve Islam for himself and his LGBTQ Muslim community, instead of perpetuating Islam's toxic beliefs and attempting to reinterpret centuries of homophobic tradition and practice, he would have been better off shedding Islam altogether and focusing on helping his community find meaning and support without attaching them to the Islam that was the main cause of their suffering. This is the curse of the moderate Muslim reformer, trapped between a rock and a hard place, desperate to cling to the comforts of faith while picking and choosing which of Islam's toxic beliefs to preserve and which ones to conveniently discard. It's an effort that may have tragically cost Hendricks his life. And that's all from me. Don't forget to like this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. You can also support this channel through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the description below. I'm Secular Spirit, and I'll be back with another video very soon.